But maybe you're familiar with the Spider-Man analogy. For those out there that don't know, Matt Dillahunty and others have talked a lot about the Spider-Man analogy, which says, hold on, if you guys are saying, look at all this stuff we see in the Gospels from Luke and all that, that's like really specific locations, names, the types of work that somebody's doing, the right term, depending on where you're at, all of that. So this gives us great reason to trust the Gospels. And then somebody like Matt Dillahunty steps up and says, hold on.
Well, my guess would be that somebody might point out how just because you get some places right or some names right of people that existed in the past, that doesn't necessarily make whatever you're reading or writing historical, because there are a lot more like pieces of historical criteria that you would need to fulfill in order to establish that whatever you're talking about is historical. So just getting a few names of places and people right does not in and of itself make whatever you're reading historical. And that's the entire point of the Spider-Man counter to pointing out that the Bible gets names of places right, because it's a horrible argument for historicity of the Bible. So if you heathens want to fuck around and find out how Braxton Hunter, Michael Jones, and Jon McCray defend Christianity against the Spider-Man counter, then please stay tuned.
Ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts.
What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be going over Braxton Hunter's one of his most recent videos where he sits down with Jon McCray of Whaddoyoumeme and Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy to discuss why the Spider-Man counter to the Bible getting a few minute details correct, and that proving that the Bible is a historical account. That's literally the only thing that the Spider-Man counter is really all that useful for, because if you're going to sit there and say, oh, well, the Bible's historical because they got Jerusalem right, which, depending on the context in which you're talking about, you could be wrong. That the Bible gets it right. The Gospels, especially I believe it's Luke's Gospel, gets a number of geographic locations wrong in the way that it describes them and their positioning and everything like that, which just shows that the author of Luke was not native to the area, so he didn't know what in the hell he was talking about. And there are other details that the Gospels get correct, like Pilate being in that area or ruling over that area at the time for the Roman government, and things of that nature.
Makes you think I would want to know that? Who wouldn't?
Just because the Bible gets a few things correct as far as names of people and places, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Bible is historical in all of its context. In fact, there's a very specific fallacy for this, and it's called the composition fallacy. It's when you take a small portion of a larger set and then apply whatever conclusion you can make off of that small portion to the larger set that it's contained within. A similar use of the fallacy would be saying, oh, well, this group of people over there, a small number of them like to go around hurting people. So that means that entire demographic likes to go around and kill people or hurt people or whatever. That's another use of this same fallacy. You're taking a small portion of a larger set, making some kind of conclusion about it, and then applying that to the larger set. And that seems to be what is happening in the refutation of the Spider-Man counter here. They go a little bit more in depth into explaining it or talking about it, and they make very specific claims about Christianity and early Judaism. So let's hop on into it.
What if in 2,000 years we said, hey, look, there's a guy here writing about New York City. It's got the Empire State Building, the Statue of Liberty. Here's where it is. Here's the names of the streets. Therefore, there's a good case to be made that Spider-Man's true, that takes place in New York City. Your thoughts first?
Well, if I will interject my thoughts. If you erase any good history that we could have for this period, and the only thing to survive would have been the comic books or whatever literature surrounding Spider-Man that would exist or persist on into the future, Let's say that we have no knowledge that he was invented, kind of similar to what we have about Jesus. We don't have any direct information about Jesus as a person if he were to have existed. All we have are later things that are written about him. And so most New Testament scholars and textual critics like Bart Ehrman, they end up having to speculate about things and invent sources that suggest that Jesus did certain things or were from specific places. And so if we had a comparable situation, or we at least applied that to any other character in history that's fictional, I don't know if we would have a good enough criteria to discern a true historical person from any fictional person. So that is the point of bringing up the Spider-Man analogy. And that's the reason why it's a counter to saying that the Bible presents us with accurate historical information, which it doesn't. That's not even, going against mainstream scholarship there. That's the mainstream scholarship, is that the Gospels contain a lot of non-historical information, and I have yet to see good criteria to separate actual historical information from fictional information. So until we can actually do that, it kind of seems like we don't know exactly, what happened, or even if Jesus did exist. Although I think a solid case can be made that Jesus probably didn't exist. That's not really my main focus for this video. I think that I could totally accept that Jesus existed in history and we just simply don't know anything about him. But it would still be comparable to the Spider-Man analogy, because of the fact that we don't have any direct information about the person. All we have are later documents that are written about said person. These later documents are magical and fantastical in their characterization of this person. I don't see a big difference between Spider-Man and Jesus at this point. But let's see what Michael Jones has to say.
Yeah, we know Spider-Man is fiction. If you're going to ask people 40 years after Spider-Man was written, people are going to say, well, this is a work of fiction.
Yeah.
People that were writing about Jesus wrote about him as if he was an historical figure. Every early Christian did, Tacitus did, Pliny, Lucian, Josephus, they all wrote about him as if he was a historical person.
So right off the bat, Michael Jones is not applying a good comparison between the evidence that we have for Jesus and, say, the evidence we have for Spider-Man. If we were to apply the same kind of criteria that we have for Jesus that we would have for Spider-Man, I think it's very likely somebody could have thought that somebody was historically at the core of the Spider-Man story.
Who am I? You sure you want to know? The story of my life is not for the faint of heart. If somebody said it was a happy little tale, if somebody told you I was just your average ordinary guy, not a care in the world, somebody lied.
Because those that were writing later, like the gospel writers and all of the church fathers that he mentioned, they all thought that he was historical because it had been portrayed since 70 AD that he was historical. He was euhemerized into history. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for Michael Jones to inappropriately compare these two situations. It's almost like he's setting it up so that he can compare them and immediately knock down the Spider-Man counter because it's just ridiculous and doesn't match the Jesus story. But that's simply not true. Also, everybody that he mentioned, except for maybe Josephus, they were writing in the 2nd century when Jesus was already established to be a historical figure due to the euhemerization that occurred in the 70s. So it doesn't make sense for him to bring up those people as proof that Jesus was only ever thought of as a historical figure, and never thought of as, a possibly purely celestial figure. I also see this heading in the direction of monolithically painting the Jewish and Christian faiths. I feel like if you're going to have this kind of discussion, it behooves you to point out how diverse Christian beliefs were at this time, but more importantly, how diverse Jewish beliefs also were. So you don't ever have like Judaism or Christianity being like a monolithically believed theology. Like, there's no one theology of Judaism or Christianity that was the only version of the religion. And I feel like that's what Michael Jones is getting into here.
So that right there shows you this is a bad analogy to begin with. And second of all, the story of Christianity about a dead and resurrected Messiah does not fit with the Jewish background of what they were expecting when a Messiah was supposed to come. They were expecting a conqueror, someone who's going to defeat Rome.
Well, I would agree that some Jews were expecting that. And that's very obvious. If you look at Josephus, he mentions a bunch of failed messiahs, failed prophets that were supposed to do exactly that. But again, they failed. But still, Jews rallied behind them because there were some Jews that thought that. But to present that as a monolithic idea of Judaism, like as if Judaism was this one idea, and the one idea they had about the Messiah was a military Messiah that was going to come and fuck up the Romans. That's just false. And we know that to be false because there are several different Jewish sects that were going around in the first century, either BCE or CE. You had multiple ones going around claiming different things about the Messiah. If you look at the Nag Hammadi library, you'll see that various different ideas about Jesus were going around at the time. And even once the Gospels were starting to be written, you still had a wide variety of ideas about Jesus. I mean, you had whole infancy Gospels that were written where, Jesus peed on some dirt, made some mud birds, and then killed a kid. You have all these various ideas about the Messiah, but more importantly, saying that they weren't expecting anything other than a military Messiah just shows you're either trying to hide information from your audience or you don't know about the information.
You set me up.
No, I didn't set you up.
You lied to me.
No, I'm trying to help you. Let me help you.
I would tend to lean towards ignorance if Michael Jones hadn't already done a whole lot of research into this area. So, I mean, I know that he knows about other sects of Jews as well as multiple sects of Christians that were going around. So to suggest that a dying and rising Messiah wasn't in the background information of Christianity is just ridiculous.
And instead they got somebody who preached that we were all sinners, that even many of the Jews had become sons of Satan, which does not fit with that at all, and that he was going to die for their sins and then rise, and that would prove he's going to be the Messiah. It's completely an anomaly in terms of the background.
I mean, has Michael Jones read the Old Testament? I mean, I'm honestly asking here. I'm not trying to be a dick, although I may be coming off as a dick. I get it. But I don't know if he's actually read the Old Testament, because at several points during the Old Testament, while they didn't have a concept of Satan or anything like that, God definitely got pissed off at the Israelites for worshiping other deities, for them being bad people. In the Old Testament, you have this concept of the remnant. And that's the leftover, Israelites after God has killed off all of the ones that aren't, bowing down to him, or that are violating his laws and everything like that. People that are not going to fall in line with him. I don't think that characterizing some of the Jews as being the quote unquote sons of Satan, which I'm not sure where he's getting that from, but let's just assume that he knows what he's talking about here. I really don't think that that's out of the realm of possibility for the Jewish beliefs. And I mean, if you want to talk about what Jewish beliefs were and how diverse they could be, as if to say, oh, no, there's no Jews that would believe any of this. For one, you can't actually say that because we don't have absolute information about all of the beliefs of the Jews going around in the first century BCE or the first century CE. So we can't say that they would not have believed it, especially considering the content of the Old Testament. But also, if you just look at the different sects of Jews that were going around, you had the more strict Orthodox, which was, I guess, more the mainstream idea that was running in Jewish theology at the time. You have that group, but then you have other group like the Essenes and these other various groups that had beliefs that were wildly different than the Orthodox beliefs of Jews. To suggest that it would be crazy for a Jew to believe these things, considering all of this information, I don't see how he can actually defend that position. because there's no way that he can say they will not believe this, or they categorically did not believe, like no Jew believed this. I do believe that what he's talking about here is that no Orthodox Jews would have believed it. So, I mean, there's that. But I don't think that you should take the Orthodox or the mainstream idea of Jews and apply that to every single Jew that existed, which I think is the implication that Michael Jones is making. Also, a dying and rising Messiah is not a complete anomaly considering the background of everything. For one thing, you had Jews that were definitely looking to the Old Testament scriptures in order to reinterpret them and give them a more messianic spin. Why else would you have the Gospels refer back to the Old Testament when they're talking about how Jesus was supposed to rise and or die and rise again? Not only that, but also, why would the Jews then later develop, like after Christianity came and went, why would the Jews then go back and reorganize their thoughts on who the Messiah was supposed to be and come up with their current two Messiah hypothesis? Which, what the two Messiah hypothesis is that there's one Messiah that's going to come to die, and then there's another Messiah that will come and resurrect the Messiah that died, and they will provide salvation to all the Jews. And so why would Jews that apparently had direct contact with the Christian story then later develop an interpretation of Jewish theology that would absolve Christian theology? I mean, they've always painted the Jews as being very much anti-Christian in the Gospels, even just in general in the first century and as Christianity was developing. Why is it that they would later develop this hypothesis about the Jewish Messiah that seems to be pretty much the same thing as what Christianity's saying, except Christianity has merged those two concepts? And if you're looking for evidence that the Jews were, reinterpreting Old Testament scripture so that they can know something about the Messiah that has yet to come, all you have to do is look at Philo of Alexandria. He was interpreting Old Testament information to be about his Logos character, who was supposed to be the Messiah of the Jewish people. So it seems to me like saying that the background information of Judaism is not coherent with Christian theology. I feel like that's just totally ignoring all of the developments of the Jewish community that we know about up until Christianity started making a lot of waves. Knowing that is crucial, and not bringing that up, not talking about it, makes it look like Jones is either ignorant of it or trying to hide it, or maybe he thinks it's inconsequential. Regardless of the reason why he's not bringing any of this up, I feel like anybody that is listening to Michael Jones in this particular video should definitely press X to doubt, because he's obviously doing a lot of things wrong. One, he's painting the Jewish ideas monolithically as being about this military Messiah. It wasn't. Two, he's saying that the Jews were not expecting a dying and rising Messiah, so why would Christianity ever pop up if, they weren't expecting that? When in reality, it turns out that the Jews were expecting a similar dying and rising Messiah, and they definitely wouldn't have developed that after Christianity formed, and failed to at least handle how Jesus was not the dying and rising Messiah in their own theology. It seems to me like Michael Jones is just wrong on a lot of different aspects here. But hey, let's see what Jon McCray has to say. Come on, what do you mean?
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. And I haven't heard any of them make this case, so hopefully I'm not strawman in their position. But
wait a second, you're going to start off your entire segment here with, I've never heard an atheist say this shit, but, hopefully I'm not strawmanning them when I say what I'm about to say, which, just to reiterate, I've never heard them say this shit. Are you fucking serious?
I mean, just think about it kind of practically here. Like, during the time in the first century too, during the time of Jesus, the disciples, the first Christians, they were willing to die for Jesus, right? For the truth of Christianity and of Christ's resurrection.
Are you serious? They wouldn't die for a lie? Like that's the argument that you're pulling out of your back pocket right here in order to say that, oh, the Spider-Man analogy, shit. Really? Come on, John. you got to have a better argument against the Spider-Man analogy than, they wouldn't die for a lie, or that, no, I feel like the direction that he's going here is that, nobody would die for Spider-Man. Taking Spider-Man as we currently understand him and pitting him against Jesus is not a fair comparison. And that's not the analogy that's used. The analogy that's used is, hey, what if in the future we have no historical records from now except for these comic books that paint a fantastical character out of this guy Spider-Man? We would probably believe that he was a historical figure too. And your thing is, people wouldn't die for a lie. How do you know? There are plenty of people in the comic books that would die for Spider-Man. So how do you know that they wouldn't die how do you know they wouldn't die for Spider-Man or anything like that? Like, I don't know. This just seems like a stupid argument.
So that's obviously different. You're not going to get a lot of people today that are going to be willing to die for Spider-Man, given that Spider-Man is real and stake their lives on it, right? You're just not going to get that. And even if you say that maybe some people would, sure, but that's not going to be a whole community like it was in the New Testament of these Jews that were very devout and had every reason to reject Jesus being God in the flesh and resurrecting. They weren't predicting a Messiah that would, a dying and rising Messiah, and especially in the middle of time. You know what I mean? The resurrection is supposed to come at the end of time. So
I feel like what Jon McCray is doing here is he's kind of shooting his own self in his foot. Because if you're going to sit there and say that the Old Testament prophesizes Jesus's, everything that Jesus did, his death, his resurrection, and saying that, there were no Jews that were expecting this, while at the same time knowing that Paul writes that the Old Testament informs him about these things, that according to the scriptures, these things happen to Jesus. It amazes me how quickly Christian apologists are just like, well, nobody was expecting this. Are you fucking kidding me? Paul writes about how he was expecting it. How a certain interpretation of Old Testament scripture was definitely expecting it. And also to dispel this notion that nobody would have died for Spider-Man, or nobody would have potentially died or given up their life for Spider-Man, I submit this as evidence.
He's mine! You want to get to him, you got to go through me.
And me.
Me too.
Very well.
Let's say the only thing that we had was this movie, and we have no information about this movie. It could be a dramatization or whatever. You could treat it exactly like the Gospels. Let's say the Gospels are a dramatization of Jesus's life. And of course, Jesus is depicted as being this magical person, but that's all part of the dramatization of it, right? Let's say a historical person existed. Well, in Spider-Man 2, people were willing to stand up to Doc Ock and prevent Doc from taking Spider-Man. They were willing to lay down their lives in order to protect Spider-Man and stand up for him. And so this is actually better than what happened with Jesus, because with Jesus died, resurrected, and then went to heaven. And then followers are expected to lay down their lives to believe in Jesus. What's claimed by Christians didn't even fucking happen. Like, I'm not saying that Christians weren't persecuted later, but what I'm saying is that people that supposedly knew Jesus, we don't know if they died. We don't know if they were persecuted. We don't know if they were martyred. We don't know a goddamn thing about them. You know why? Because we don't have any records about them. Of course, Jon McCray, Braxton, and Inspiring Philosophy are going to say that the Gospels are historical documents that are eyewitness accounts in one fashion or another. I'm not sure about Inspiring Philosophy's view on the Gospels and whether or not they're eyewitness accounts, but I definitely know that Braxton and Jon McCray are down that alley. But suggesting that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts is counterintuitive to what we know about historical accounts of real people. And to use that to say that we know anything about the supposed eyewitnesses of Jesus is just wrong. I don't know how else to put it without being a dick, but it's just wrong. It's counter to all the academics that are currently working in the field, except for the evangelical and I guess New Testament people, like real historians. They acknowledge the fact that the Gospels are not historical accounts that were written by eyewitnesses. Plenty of work has been done on this. So to act like they are eyewitness accounts is a bit ridiculous. But again, Jon McCray, just like Michael Jones over there, is painting the Christian ideas and Jewish ideas as being monolithic ideas, as being one particular theology that is shared by all Christians or all Jews. And that's just simply not what happened. And I know that they're not directly saying, oh, Christians only believe this, but they are implying that this was the only thing that they were expecting. This was the only narrative that they were running with. That's what they're implying here. While they may not explicitly be saying that, they are definitely suggesting that. But in the end, we don't know if eyewitnesses to Jesus were ever martyred for just believing in Jesus. We don't know if they were killed. They eventually died. But my point is that we know nothing about them, so there's no way that you can use, they wouldn't have died for a lie, and people wouldn't die for Spider-Man because Spider-Man's a lie. Therefore, Jesus is real. Praise Jesus, Dick!
So anyways, it goes against their expectations, but they still fell down and worshiped a man as God, and also were willing to stake their lives on that claim. So much so that there's reports of them even like laughing when they were going to be executed and stuff, because they had that much trust and confidence that Jesus was the true God. So the equivalent to Spider-Man, not a good one in my opinion.
Well, of course, in your opinion, it's not going to be a good idea. Obviously, it's not going to be a good idea. You're totally starstruck with the Jesus story. So yeah, you're not going to think it's a good idea. But the situations that he's talking about here with the martyrs and people laughing at their deaths or whatever, I don't know where he's getting that from. I perfectly fine assuming that he's correct on it, but I would have to press X to doubt about anything that they say in this video. My point is that the people that he's talking about were being martyred and executed and persecuted and everything like that far after the euhemerization of Jesus into history. So yes, Christians that are third or fourth, generation Christians living, in the 2nd century and beyond, they were being martyred for their faith because they believed in it, and there was no reason for them to doubt what they believed. So they were fine, dying for what they believed in. This does not prove the truth of what they believe. And I would say the exact same thing as the Spider-Man evidence presented here. Just because some people on the train were willing to stand in front of a human octopus guy doesn't mean that story is true. Just like Spider-Man taking place in New York and having all of these real world cities that are frequented in the Marvel universe, that does not mean that any of that is historical. And going back to Christianity, just because Pilate is mentioned, just because King David is mentioned, or even Solomon, or any of the historical places that we know exist are mentioned in the Bible, that doesn't then mean that the Bible is historical or historically accurate. Now, I'm not going to say that the entirety of the Bible is fictional in a sense, because while they do get some people, places, and events correct in the fact that they happened, all of those minute details does not mean that the entire story of the Bible, especially the Gospels, are true or historical. I think that you got to do a lot more academic research into whether or not they are historical, which has been done, and the verdict has come out to be that they are most likely fictional. As in, most of the Gospels, most of the New Testament is not representative of history. While some portions may be representative of history, for the most part, they are not considered historical documents, historically reliable documents. Well, heathens, that's it for the short video here. I really appreciate y'all stopping by and watching. What do you think about the Spider-Man analogy that's a counter to picking or cherry picking parts of the Bible that are matching up with history and then proclaiming the Bible or the Gospels or anything to be historical or historically reliable? What do you think about that? Do you think the Spider-Man analogy is useful, or do you think that it's shit? Let me know in the comments down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.